let me give you a little introduction about Ryan. This is the third time we've had Ryan try to give this presentation. He's given a presentation to us before. And of course, he was a member of our executive committee for several years. Ryan was born in Maine, and he moved to Virginia after graduation, and he went to the University of Mary Washington, where he received his Bachelor of Arts degree. And he's worked for a number of museums, the George Washington Foundation. He worked for Colonial Williamsburg, and now he's working for the National Park Service here in Fredericksburg. And he wrote a book, which I have got a copy of right here, about the Battle of Monocacy, Determined to Stand and Fight. And it was published, I believe, in 2017. And if you do happen to go to Monocacy, I would highly recommend this as to take it on along with you. It's got an excellent portion of touring the battlefield. It's got a order of battle, and of course the narrative about the battle itself. But if you turn to the back of the book, the touring the battlefield part is really useful. So if you go, you ought to take a look at this. And he's currently, as I said, a park guide here at Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania National Military Park. And you're working on a second book, I understand now, about the topic you're going to talk to us tonight, Drainsville. So good luck with that. And Ryan, it's all yours.
Well, thanks, John. I appreciate that. And I appreciate everyone having me back. It's great to be back talking to the round table, even if virtually. Give me just 1 second to set up my PowerPoint, and then we can hit the ground running. So let's take a look. Okay. Yes. So as John said, I've been working on my second book, which is about this topic, the Battle of Drainsville in 1861. But tonight we're not going to be talking about the battle itself. We're going to be doing it a little bit differently. We're going to be talking about the civilians of Drainsville and their experiences that year. Drainsville is a really unique situation wherein when we think about battles, we think about them occurring because of their strategic location, right? Fredericksburg, because of its location halfway between the two warring capitals, or Gettysburg, so our roads met. Drainsville is largely fought because of what the civilians in 1861 do and their actions and their consequences. And so with that in mind, I want to start the story at the end. The end of the story is the battle itself, which takes place on December 20th of 1861. This is a woodcut that was published in Harper's Weekly. And in the foreground are the United States soldiers, Pennsylvanians, firing on the Confederates in the distance. The battle itself doesn't last very long, a couple hours, results in about 250 casualties. And its most famous part of import is that it's one of the very few federal victories in 1861. Again, this coming on December 20th of 1861 was kind of a badly needed morale boost to the Union public. But again, the story I want to talk about is actually the lead up to the battle. And Drainsville itself is sometimes characterized as an accidental engagement between two foraging parties, right? Pennsylvania's looking for food and Confederates looking for food. They run into each other and they fight. And while that's not wrong, it's only part of the story. And so what I want to look at, our kind of first actual slide, is this text here. This is the order given to the U.S. Army commander, a guy named Edward Ord, by his commanding officer the night before the battle. And you'll notice that the order really falls into two sections. The second half is collect some food while you're in the area. But you'll notice in the first half, it's to secure the area because Confederates have been rumored to be picking up Unionist civilians and putting them in jail. And so this reconnaissance force of around 5,000 Pennsylvanians belonging to the Pennsylvania Reserve Corps are in a way going to Drainsville as a police force to intercede on the behalf of the Union public. And as you stare at these orders, you kind of wonder, well, what in the heck is going on here? Why does the Union Army care so much about what's going on in Drainsville? Why are they sending 5,000 federal forces, 4 cannon, and a whole bunch of wagons to the small town? And the answer to that question is December 20th is not the first time the U.S. Army is going to Drainsville. In fact, it's the 4th or 5th time they're going to Drainsville. And so the actions of that fall and summer kind of reveal to us what war was like in Northern Virginia in 1861 on the civilian side. We're so used to studying the battle through the purview of First Manassas or Ball's Bluff, but what are the civilians in Drainsville doing that brought the armies here? So we'll start with this map. You'll see Washington, D.C. on the far right-hand side of the map, and you'll see Drainsville towards the top. And I want to show this map just in case there are some of us who don't quite know where this town is. Drainsville was and still is a very small town. It's located equidistant between Leesburg and Washington, D.C. In 1861, it's such a small town, it doesn't even really qualify as its own town. The census done in 1860 doesn't say the town of Drainsville, it's just the people of Fairfax County. If you had to take a guess, probably a population of around 500 people, give or take a few. But it is a kind of happening place. Because of its equidistant location between Washington and Leesburg, it had been a kind of overnight stopping point for wagons and travelers heading from one city or the other, and they would stop in Drainsville and then carry on the next morning. The other town I want to point out on this map is to the right of Drainsville, and that's the smaller town of Lewinsville. We're going to be talking about both of those towns, so just kind of take a mental note of where those two towns are and their locations on each other. And then this is a very, my attempt to kind of show the town as it existed in 1860 and 1861, the downtown area of Drainsville, if you would. You'll see the Georgetown Pike, you'll see the Leesburg Pike, and then the people's names in the area are, again, kind of the downtown area. And there are two names I want to point out just right here. You'll see a couple of Days and you'll see a couple of Colemans. And again, those are names we're going to be talking about for the next 45 minutes or so. The Coleman family had been in the area since the early 18th century. They had been in the area the longest. They're kind of the established family. And the Days, while new to the area, having been moved in the 1840s, were both doctors. So they had kind of a position of authority in the town. And as secession kicks off and as the war kicks off, we'll be talking a whole lot about them. Just for the sake of conversation, you'll see on the right-hand side of the map a house called Thornton and a house called R. Coleman. That is the battlefield in 1861. That's where the armies are going to be fighting, right on the edge of the town. But again, you'll see all of these other houses in the downtown area. So the story for Drainsville really gets started with the Secession Crisis, right? South Carolina leads the way in December of 1860, December 20th, in fact, 1860, when South Carolina secedes. Mississippi follows, Texas follows. But Virginia is not so sure about secession. They are unsure about what to do. And in fact, instead of just unilaterally seceding, Virginia is going to convene a convention in Richmond in February of 1861 to discuss secession. What to do, what not to do, should we not. And on April 4th, the first vote is actually in favor of union. You'll see on the right-hand side of the map, Northern Virginia is especially very blue. Fairfax is white because its delegate hadn't arrived yet. So its delegate does not vote for secession on that first vote. And then a couple of things are going to change that fact. One is Fort Sumter on April 12th of 1861. This kind of martial spirit rushes through the South. Secondly is Abraham Lincoln's request for 75,000 volunteers on April 15th. And thirdly are the arrival of secession speakers, advocates from the Deep South, who go to the secession convention and talk about how useful it would be if Virginia were to join the rest of the Confederacy. John Letcher, who was the governor of Virginia in 1861, met those speakers cordially and invitationally, and he met Abraham Lincoln's request for volunteers with ice coldness. He in fact says, "You have chosen to inaugurate civil war." So when a second vote takes place on the 17th of April, you'll see how the counties switch pretty rapidly. You'll notice Western Virginia, right, which is to be soon become West Virginia, why that is such a heavily prevalent Unionist area. You'll also notice Fairfax County is no longer white, it's blue. The secession, the delegate elected from Fairfax County actually voted for Union. However, the convention also issues part of its decree a civilian vote. They're going to put the tally up to the civilian population of Virginia to vote on May 23rd, 1861. So the civilians will be able to go to the polls and either vote for Union or for not. It's largely a ceremonial function. No one really doubts the fact that Virginia is going to secede on May 23rd, but it's just kind of a formality that needs to occur. But the problem with that is that these votes were not private. These votes were by public roll call. You either A, stood up when they shouted out your name and you shouted out your vote, or you took your ballot, you walked up to the pollster and you put your ballot in each of the respective bowls, yes or no. Either way, they know who you vote for. Your vote is not private. And so from 1860, the presidential election, to voting for the commissioners for the secession delegation, and then finally the secession vote itself, in the span of about 5 months, you have now voted 3 times, and your allegiance is going to become pretty apparent pretty rapidly. And the reason I make such a big deal about this is that when we talk about Unionists and Confederate sympathizers amongst the Drainsville population, lines are drawn pretty quickly down the line, who's Unionist and who's Confederate. And the Day brothers are 2 rabid secessionists, William on the left and his half-brother John T on the right. Again, had moved to Drainsville in the 1840s. They were doctors. They were well-respected. They are virulently pro-secession. William B. Day, again on the left, claimed that if he could have prevented Abraham Lincoln from entering the White House, he would have crawled knee-deep in blood to accomplish it. And they don't calm down their ardor in the lead up to the secession vote on May 23rd, 1861. Just as an example, some of the Unionists in town talk about the Day brothers later and what they do and what they force upon people, I guess, if you want to say it that way. One Unionist says that William B. Day was most active in the cause of secession and told at one time in conversation that he would give half his property to South Carolina were they to aid her in her efforts to carry out secession. So that kind of lead up to May 23rd and the follow-up, again, they're going to become kind of the leaders of the secession movement in Drainsville. After the vote happens, John T on the right pays a local blacksmith to make him a Bowie knife, an 18-inch long Bowie knife. And he was reported to be walking up and down the streets of town brandishing that Bowie knife, claiming, he said that he had got it to cut out the hearts of Union men. And he said that if he had his way, he would kill all the damned Yankee sons of bitches in the country, for they were all abolitionists. And these are quotes by Unionists who were later testifying to federal officials in Washington, because it becomes rapidly apparent that Unionists are not welcome in Drainsville. And so many of them flee to Washington, D.C., the safety of Washington, D.C. once the war gets started. But you kind of see this rising tide of kind of how the lines are being drawn. May 23rd, 1861, again, never really in doubt. Drainsville is one of 13 polling locations in Fairfax County, and you can see how the vote goes. 107 people vote in favor for secession, 4 vote against. And again, because these are public roll calls, we know who those 4 are. We know who these people are. We know their voting tallies. You'll notice second down is Howard Lasher. Howard Lasher later claimed to federal officials that when he voted for Union, William B. Day told him he would mark him. And Lasher took that as a threat to get out of town as quickly as possible. And this is not just unique to Fairfax County. In Fredericksburg, there was a vote for secession. It took place in the city courthouse. And somebody voted for Union. And Thomas Knox, who lived at what is today the Kenmore Inn, stood up and said the next man who so voted should be hanged. And the Unionists in Fredericksburg very quickly shut up. So this is not a unique problem to Fairfax. It's not a unique problem to Fredericksburg. There is voter intimidation throughout the country, throughout the state. Now, Lewinsville, just 11 miles down the road from Drainsville, is the opposite. Lewinsville votes rapidly or overwhelmingly in favor of staying in the Union. In Lewinsville, another polling location, they voted 86 to 37 in favor of staying in the Union. And so people who lived together, farmed together, went to church together, are now seeing their battle lines being drawn very rapidly down the center. The fighting hasn't even started yet in Virginia, right? On May 24th, the day after secession, Alexandria is going to be occupied by U.S. forces, but the fighting that we're seeing this kind of building momentum even before the fighting even really gets started. And because this persecution of Unionists is kind of well known, on the left-hand side, this is a comic that was printed in the Harper's Weekly paper. And you'll see at the bottom how Virginia was voted out of the Union. And you'll see the person who has their vote in their hand. They can either vote yes for secession or they can vote no to stay in the Union. But you'll notice there's a gun pointing out the window that says no. And so this persecution of Unionists was well known. And those who did not flee to Washington became the targets of pro-Confederate, pro-secessionist militias. In Drainsville, it was known as a home guard. William B. Day, John Day, Charles Coleman formed a home guard where they would just kind of be bullies, and they would ride up and down the streets and they would harass Unionists. The gravestone on the right is to a man named Leverett Bishop. Leverett Bishop was 75 years old in 1861. His son had voted in favor of staying in the Union, and then his son rapidly flees to Washington, getting out of town. But Leverett Bishop stays in Fairfax. And the thought was no one's going to bother this 75-year-old man, but that is not the case. Leverett Bishop is arrested, thinking that he was aiding his son in Washington. He is sent to Richmond to go into prison. He's released in the fall of 1861, and he has to walk back to Fairfax. He makes it as far as Warrenton, where he's thrown in jail again. And in December of 1861, he dies of turmoil, of hardship, of heartache. He dies. And he is buried probably in an unknown grave in Warrenton. The gravestone is kind of a ceremonial stone. It doesn't mark his grave, but he is probably buried in an unknown grave in Warrenton outside the city jail. And Leverett Bishop's son, Henry, finds out about that. And he writes in the Washington, D.C. newspaper, "Dr. Day has done this. My father's blood is on his hands and the blood of others, and Union mothers whose Union sons have been forced into the rebel army are heaping curses upon his head. And every Union man in that vicinity laid at his door the chief cause of their persecution." And so the turmoil is rising. The heat of the moment is rising, but they are not the only ones. In Herndon, just to the south of Fairfax, lived the Hanna family, Nathaniel Hanna and his wife, Catherine, who went by the name of Kitty. The house still exists in Herndon. This is a modern photograph of the Hanna household. Just before the Battle of Manassas, the Drainsville Home Guard they mobilized to go to Manassas. They did not arrive in time to fight the battle, but Nathaniel Hanna, who was part of the Drainsville Home Guard, decided he suddenly didn't really want to be there anymore. And so in the quiet of the night, he fled to Washington, leaving his wife, his children, his mother-in-law back in Herndon. Well, Catherine Hanna, this is a photo of her later in life, talked about the aftermath of that action. And she said in the middle of the night on July 22nd or July 23rd, when she was sleeping in bed, she heard a number of horses pull up to the side of her house, and a voice called out, "That is where Nat Hanna lives." There's a flurry of feet. There's a pounding on her door. She opens the door to find William B. Day, who had just returned from Manassas, and he had a gun in his hand. And he demanded entry into the Hanna household to see if Nathaniel Hanna was in the house. He went inside the home. He upturned some beds, pushed over some closets, but Nathaniel Hanna was nowhere to be found. And so they left. It, of course, left Catherine Hanna spooked. She packed up her family and she moved out of Herndon pretty rapidly. So this is kind of, again, building up momentum. We're only in July, right? Remember, the impact of all is a battle is going to happen in December, and here we are in July. The next thing that's going to occur happens when U.S. soldiers arrive in the area of Drainsville. You notice on this map at the bottom is the town of Drainsville itself. About 5 miles to the north of Drainsville is the Potomac River. And you'll notice at the top of the map an area known as Lowe's Island. This was property that belonged to a man named Enoch Lowe. The island was next to some locks on the C&O Canal, the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal. And the U.S. forces moved into the area to protect those locks. They're ordered there to protect the C&O Canal and the ability of boats to move up and down the canal unhindered. And the unit that was assigned to the area was the 34th New York Infantry. And they arrive in the fall of 1861, September, October of 1861. And they move into the area. And almost immediately, skirmishing begins. Confederates are firing pot shots from Virginia. The New Yorkers are firing pot shots from Maryland, Seneca Falls, Maryland. And Lowe's Island becomes a frequent target for U.S. soldiers to cross the river and take things, whether it's food, whether it's animals. They are stealing, they're foraging, and they're moving back into Maryland. Well, one night, Enoch Lowe decides he's had enough. And Enoch Lowe rides the 5 miles back to Drainsville to report on this repeated advances on his land. And he wants to know what's going to be done about it. The Drainsville Home Guard decide they're going to take it upon themselves to deal with this cumbersome problem, in their opinion. And so the night of September 16th, 1861, the Drainsville Home Guard organized an ambush. They just have to wait for the U.S. forces to cross again. And so William B. Day, his brother, and some others go north to Lowe's Island and just wait. They realize that's all they have to do is wait. And at nightfall, coming across the river, is a small patrol of soldiers from the 34th New York Infantry, led by Captain Wells Sponable. You'll see he's joined by Private Oliver Darling, Private Robert Gracie, and Private Cyrus Kellogg. They cross the river and they advance towards a cornfield. And Sponable writes that he takes the lead, and he says, Darling in the center and Gracie brought up the rear. The whole of the picket they were following had not crossed over the logs when I heard a slight noise in the cornfield on my left. He looked, and not over 3 rods distant from me, he could see guns in the moonlight. A volley of musketry and pistols and shotguns go off. Oliver Darling is killed instantly. He drops to the ground. Sponable falls to the ground, and he sees Gracie and Kellogg fall as well. Sponable thinks all 3 of them have been killed, so he crawls his way back to the river, swims across the river, losing a boot in the process. But not everyone was killed. Only Oliver Darling was killed. Gracie and Kellogg are both wounded and captured in the scuffle. Kellogg's wounds were minor, so he was soon sent on to Richmond. Gracie, however, had been shot in the chest, and he gets sent to William B. Day's house, right? William B. Day was a doctor. Gracie's in need of medical attention, so they assume, let's just put him inside the house to be cared for. And yet, according to Gracie, William B. Day does not help him, does not treat his wounds, does not give him any bandages, doesn't do anything. And so, as Gracie wrote, here 2 resident physicians by the name of Day, let these names be remembered, gave him no advice. For 2 weeks, Gracie lay in the neighborhood and they made no effort for his relief. Gracie, after 2 weeks, was sent to Fairfax Courthouse, where Confederate surgeons did treat his wounds, and then he escaped. He, according to his own telling, kind of husbanded some morphine, and one night slipped it into the drinks of unsuspecting guards. They went to sleep, and he slowly and surely made his way back across the river to the 34th New York. The 34th New York soldiers were very angry, and they wanted to cross over the river and essentially burn Drainsville, but they weren't allowed to. The reason they weren't allowed to is because, as you all found out last month, the Battle of Ball's Bluff is in the offing, right? And so federal forces were diverted towards Ball's Bluff to help out in that effort. And so the 34th New York never gets to have their revenge. And that probably could have sort of been the end of it, but it's not. So what happens, right? Here we are in the fall of 1861. Some U.S. soldiers have been killed. The Drainsville Home Guard are still riding around. So the question becomes, how does this continue? And the answer is the arrival of more U.S. soldiers. To the east of both Drainsville and Lewinsville is the small town of Langley. Today, it's the location of CIA headquarters outside of Washington, D.C. And in the fall of 1861, 10,000 Pennsylvanians under the command of George McCall crossed the Potomac River and set up Camp Pierpont at Langley. They've got 3 brigades of infantry, all led by familiar characters, John Reynolds, George Meade, and Edward Ord. And they set up in Langley, and they are keeping an eye on things. And they go to Drainsville for repeated reconnaissances and to gather supplies. And when they do, the Drainsville Home Guard flees, right? They don't want anything to do with regular U.S. forces, and so they flee. So as far as the Pennsylvanians are concerned, Drainsville is in the area, but not really to be a threat. Another camp that is established is Camp Griffin, which is at Langley. Another division of soldiers under the command of William Smith are at Lewinsville. So between William Smith's division and McCall's division, you have somewhere in the neighborhood of 15 to 20,000 United States soldiers. And in November 25th of 1861, 3 enslaved people walk into camp. Caroline Jackson, Joseph Ordwick, and Isaac Madison walk into camp. And they claim they have a story to tell, and they want to talk to some Union official. And they meet with this man, who was Winfield Scott Hancock, who was at that time a brigade commander at Lewinsville, at Camp Griffin. And the 3 of them sit down with Hancock, and they tell their story. And they claim that they had been enslaved by the Coleman family, and they claim that they know who had orchestrated the ambush of those U.S. soldiers about a month and a half before. And as Hancock writes back to Washington, D.C., this long paragraph, I'll put it on the screen for you all, you can see that Hancock, based off the testimony of these 3 enslaved people, writes them down. William B. Day, John T. Day, Thomas Carper, John Coleman, Gilson Jenkins, Samuel Jenkins, Thomas Coleman, as well as others. And so because of the actions of these 3 enslaved people who have escaped, run away, and by night moved ever so slowly to Lewinsville, the U.S. Army now has names of people who orchestrated these ambushes. What's even more troublesome is that the enslaved people and the Unionists in the area are claiming that the Day brothers had taken the bones of dead Union soldiers and having them on displays in their houses. It's probably not true. And depending on what story you heard, it was either head bone or skulls or thigh bones or femurs. But there's some pretty gnarly things going on in Drainsville, according to these Unionists. Hancock writes back to Washington, and the Army commander, George B. McClellan, insists that something be done immediately. Right now, we're going to go get these people. And so on November 27th of 1861, this guy is sent to Drainsville. This is Colonel George Bayard of the 1st Pennsylvania Cavalry. And he has been assigned to go to Drainsville and round up all of those people that had just been listed out as the perpetrators of this ambush. So riding in the middle of the night, the 1st Pennsylvania arrives in Washington, or in Drainsville at the first of light, when everyone's still sleeping. The Pennsylvanians dismount, and then like a police raid, they kick doors down and they arrest around 10 people. They load them up in a wagon and they start to ride back towards Washington. But they hadn't been unnoticed. William Farley is from South Carolina. And in the fall of 1861, he had been a Confederate scout kind of gathering intelligence on Union forces. He hears about these federal forces moving into the area. And so with 4 people, himself and 3 others, he sets up an ambush. It is fit for a movie, the drama. You have a regiment of 900 U.S. soldiers moving back to Washington and 4 Confederates setting up an ambush. But they do. They set up an ambush. And as the federal forces get closer, Farley and his men are ensconced in a thicket. And as they round a bend, Farley and his soldiers open fire. The volley of small arms fire kills Bayard's horse, mortally wounds the 1st Pennsylvanian surgeon, and wounds a couple of others. The Pennsylvanians dismount, and they engage the Confederates in the thicket. One of the Confederates who had joined Farley and is killed in the ensuing skirmish is Thomas Coleman. Thomas Coleman of the Coleman family of Drainsville, whose kind of memorial cenotaph is still in Drainsville. He's 22, 23 years old when he's killed in this skirmish. According to the enslaved people who had gone to Lewinsville, Thomas Coleman was one of those who took part in the ambush at Lowe's Island. And so in this skirmish between Farley and Bayard, 2 Federals are killed, Thomas Coleman is killed, the rest are sent on to Washington to go to jail. But Bayard's men had not captured everyone on their list. So in the days and weeks to come, more soldiers went out from Langley to Drainsville. This is the home of John Gunnell, another prominent secession in the area. Gunnell had joined a Virginian infantry regiment to join the army, leaving his family behind. The Gunnells owned a lot of land in Fairfax County, and U.S. forces in the area realized if they could go to the Gunnell house, they could gather up more supplies. The Gunnells were related by marriage to the Coleman family. And so on December 6th of 1861, when George Meade's brigade of Pennsylvania Reserves went to the Gunnell house, they found 2 Coleman cousins on the list who hadn't been arrested. Well, they arrest them and send them on to Washington. So you'll see that here we've gone from July to August to September to October. Now we're in early December. The Union Army has already been to Drainsville a few times. There's already been shooting. There's already been killings. The Colemans, the Days are on the lists. They're waiting in jail. But there's still some actions going on in Drainsville that are going to lead to this climactic battle. And so we go back to this map. You'll see on the bottom of the town itself, and then you'll see kind of faded the home of Miner Crippen, which I will highlight for you. Crippen is a Unionist. He had not voted for secession. He didn't vote at all. He claimed he was too scared because of the persecution to vote. He flees to Washington with his neighbor, a man named Nelson Voorhees, but he returns to Drainsville every now and then. His wife, Jane, would open a window and put a small handkerchief on the windowsill because she was a spy. And if Jane Crippen had anything to tell Union officials, she would put the window up, hang a kerchief out, and Miner Crippen and Nelson Voorhees would go to the house, gather the information, and go back to Washington. Remember from the very beginning of the presentation when I showed the orders for the U.S. forces that said, yes, gather forage, but also prevent the capture of Union men in the area. Well, on December 18th, 1861, Jane Crippen tells her husband that there's a rumor floating around that Confederates in Leesburg are going to go to Drainsville and arrest whatever Unionists are left. So Miner Crippen and Nelson Voorhees take that information, go to Langley, and meet with George McCall, the Pennsylvania officer in charge. McCall decides to report that back to Washington, and he receives instructions to prevent that from happening. And so on the night of December 19th, McCall writes those orders that I showed you at the very beginning. Prevent the arrest of Union citizens and gather supplies in the area. It's going to be their 4th time going out to Drainsville. With their mind remembering the ambush of Bayard's men, they decide to leave no stone untouched. We're not going to just send 1 regiment of Pennsylvania cavalry. We're going to send 5 regiments of infantry, 4 cannon, and the whole world seems to be going to Drainsville to prevent this action from occurring. That night, Brigadier General J.E.B. Stuart, Confederate Army, is also ordered to Drainsville to gather supplies of his own. That is what's going to lead to the December 20th, 1861 Battle of Drainsville. Just very quickly go over it. Again, you'll see the homes that I mentioned at the very beginning, the Thornton and the Coleman house. Battle begins around noontime, lasts around 2 hours. Edward Ord's Pennsylvanians get the best of the engagement. They repulse Stuart. Stuart suffers around 250 casualties. Ord suffers around 60 casualties in the engagement. The Pennsylvanians even arrest 1 more civilian in town. A man named Samuel Walker, who had yet eluded federal officials, is now arrested on December 20th and sent back to Washington. The battle is a Union victory, not a very big one, but nonetheless a Union victory that gives the Union morale a boost needed going into the new year. And so the question becomes, who's even left in Drainsville? If the Unionists have fled and the Confederates are arrested and all of this is going on, who is left? And it's largely the women and children and the wives of the citizens in town. Not only Jane Crippen, but the wives of William Day and John Day, the daughters of other arrested men. And they are wondering where their husbands and fathers and brothers have gone. They were arrested on November 27th by Bayard's men, and they haven't heard from them ever since. In the meantime, the Drainsville men are in jail at the old Capitol Prison, which is on the left-hand side of the screen. The old Capitol Prison is today the location of the Supreme Court building in Washington, D.C., not far from the Capitol building. And it's here that they are arrested and sent to, again, after their arrest in November of 1861. And they're just waiting. William B. Day writes to federal officials in Washington saying, we've been arrested, but we haven't been told why we've been arrested. And no one really is sure what to do with them, because there's this odd situation of custody. The US Army arrested these civilians, which makes them the prisoners of the War Department. But in early 1862, the War Department gets a new commander, right? Simon Cameron, who had been the Secretary of War, is replaced by Edwin Stanton. So Edwin Stanton doesn't know who these people are. Why are they in jail? Charles Coleman writes to William Seward, Secretary of State, saying, I don't know why I'm in here. Well, Seward doesn't know either. So Seward writes to Union officials, Union Army officials, saying, who are these people? And the Union Army sends Alan Pinkerton on the right-hand side to do some investigations. It's kind of a comedy of errors. Nobody knows who these people are, and no one knows why they're in jail. Alan Pinkerton interviews Unionists, interviews the 3 slaves, and gathers kind of a report that he presents to the Army and to William Seward. The question becomes, why didn't these people issue a writ of habeas corpus? And the answer is because Lincoln had denied that. Lincoln had invalidated habeas corpus for the time being. He had suspended it. And so the Drainsville men have to just kind of sit in jail as the days and weeks go by, waiting for something to happen. And the breaking point comes in February of 1862, when Abraham Lincoln issues Executive Order number 2, which establishes a civilian and Army joint commission to try the cases of men and civilians who have been arrested for disloyalty. The commission is headed by these 2 people, Edwards Pierpont on the left and John Dix on the right. You'll see the civilian representative and the Army representative. Their job is to try these cases and see what has been done and see what kind of consequences can be brought to bear against disloyal subjects. However, because the Drainsville case is most often hearsay, he said, she said, there's nothing to prove for it, the cases don't go very far. Some of the people who say, if you let me go, I will sign a loyalty oath, are allowed to go. And it becomes rapidly apparent that the person who did the most violence in Drainsville was Thomas Coleman. But Thomas Coleman is dead as a result of the skirmish in November of 1861. So that's a null point as well. So the trials goes forward into March, into April, into June, until finally it's just William Day and his brother John still in jail because of that rumor of having severed limbs inside their houses. But finally realizing that that's probably not what's going on here, the commission allows for William B. Day and John Day to issue a $20,000 bond, sign an loyalty oath, and go home. So they do. This long journey of ups and downs and rumors and drama and home guards and persecution ends in June of 1862 with the release of these prisoners. It seems to me, in doing my research, it seems to me that a lot of this comes to a head because the US Army is embarking on the Peninsula Campaign. And they really don't want to deal with this anymore, right? That was yesterday's news. We've got bigger problems. George McClellan is focused on getting Richmond. And so he really doesn't care about these people. Just deal with it. Whatever needs to happen, happens. And so pretty quietly, the civilians of Drainsville are let to go home. And so we get to the end of this presentation and we ask ourselves, what can Drainsville 1861 tell us about the larger conflict? I've taken this photograph of what I like to call the Drainsville battlefield, and I kind of do that with a tongue-in-cheek. You'll notice there's nothing left. The battle was here in 1861, and so it's kind of ironic in a way that the battle has been overlooked. Yes, the battlefield has been overlooked. The civilians have been as well. And so we can ask ourselves, what can Drainsville tell us about the war in 1861? What can Drainsville tell us about the interaction between the Army and civilians in 1861? And what can it tell us about how the Army interacts with these situations going forward, 1862, 63, 64, and into 1865? Life goes on for the people of Drainsville when the war moves on. Charles Coleman, who had been arrested, becomes the postmaster of town in 1865. The Day brothers return to being respected doctors in town until their deaths in the late 1800s. And so life just kind of passes Drainsville by, which is probably why it's been paved over. But if I show you this engraving one more time, and then I go forward one more time, we can kind of see how it overlays almost perfectly. And that's kind of a good analogy, wherein we'll end with this. If you know where to look, the story comes to the front, and the story still has things to tell us. And so the stories of the civilians, the battles, it's always going to be with them. Like a shadow in the back of their minds, it's always going to be with them. But 1861, Drainsville was a troubled town. The people kind of have an interesting time where it's not like Fredericksburg where the armies are here and the civilians have to be caught in the middle. The civilians are part of the story, which I think is what makes Drainsville a pretty unique situation in 1861. So with that being said, I want to thank you all for your attention. I'm going to end the share screen here. And then if anyone has any questions, curiosities, wonderings, I'd be happy to try and answer those questions. But thank you.
So anybody out there have any questions, just unmute yourself and speak up. Well, I'll start, Ryan. I do have a question for you about the battle itself, where actually Stuart and Ord come together there on that afternoon. It almost seems that it's like as you said, the civilians all built up to that, and this was kind of an afterthought almost. I mean, it just built up, and the military comes in like that. I'm a little confused about Stuart. He's got a bunch of units with him. He's got Alabama, Kentucky, Virginia. I mean, did they just grab a few people and say, okay, we're going to go down there and do this? Or was there some sort of a rhyme and reason to that order of battle?
Yeah, good question. So in the fall of 1861, Stuart is a brigade commander of cavalry, yes, but he's also in charge of the picket posts of the Confederate Army. And so what would happen is units would rotate out. They would be on picket for 24 to 48 hours, and they would rotate out. And they would go back to their camps around Centerville or Manassas. And so the units you saw, the 1st Kentucky, the 11th Virginia, the 10th Alabama, and the 11th Kentucky, they were the ones who were on duty that day. They were the ones who were part of the picket post. And so when Stuart went to Drainsville, he said, okay, you're all on duty with me, so you're going with us. So it was purely by happenstance. It wasn't a case of, I want that unit because they've got good combat prowess. In fact, only the 11th Virginia had even seen combat. They had fought at Blackburn's Ford on July 18th. It was purely by coincidence. Who was on duty that day on the pickets? And that's what determined what units Stuart went to Drainsville with.
Okay, so if he had done it 2 days later, it could have been a whole different set.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else?
Hey, Ryan.
I'm sorry,
Hey,
go ahead.
how's it going?
Good. So how did you come across a lot of like the research that you did? Did you use newspapers or diaries, or where did you find a lot of this information on like the civilians?
Yeah, good question. You mentioned newspapers and diaries, yes. And then in the National Archives in College Park, there is what's known as Records Section number 60, which is Secretary of State records. And a part of those Secretary of State records are the day-to-day transcriptions of the commission files. So the Pierpont Dix Commission, their trials were transcribed. And so a lot of the quotes and a lot of the he said, she said came from those accounts. Now, a modern day lawyer can look at those accounts and be like, that's hearsay, that's hearsay, that's hearsay. And that kind of reveals itself why a lot of these accounts were thrown out the window, because it is hearsay. But yes, there are two, it was really cool, 2 big leather volumes that you can plop down on the table and just turn page by page. So it's in College Park. You can go check it out. The final thing I'll mention are union claims. So if you were a unionist and the U.S. Army came and took, I don't know, a couple pigs, you could put a claim in and say, I was a loyal subject, you took my stuff, pay me, please. And Minor Crippen, Nelson Voorhees, Daniel Borden, who were all these unionists in Drainsville, filed those petitions. And as part of those petitions, they said, and not only did you steal my stuff, they were mean to me, so you should give me money for that too. So that's kind of also some of the good sources. Good question.
Hey, Ryan, this is Paul.
Hey.
Hey, first off, excellent talk. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
So from the way you presented it, it would give the impression that the Union forces, I don't want to say we're on a vendetta or anything, but they had it with Drainsville and the local citizenry and everything that was going on there. And with Stuart's forces coming in from the north, was the Confederate view similar towards the Union supporters in Drainsville, or were they just truly just going in there to try to get forage for the winter, and at the same time they knew that the Union forces were there and they would have to react to them anyway, because if I remember the map correctly, they're there to really protect Leesburg to begin with. So
Yeah, it's more the second thing you said. They want the winter forage. Confederate forces in Leesburg were already pretty, I don't want to say scared, but just alarmed by how few they had and how many federal forces were in Washington. The Confederate commander in charge of Leesburg at this time period, at least, is D.H. Hill. He had replaced Nathaniel Evans after Ball's Bluff. So D.H. Hill is worried about, hey, if these guys come for me, I've got nobody. I've got a couple regiments of infantry. And so D.H. Hill is one who writes to Jeb Stuart and says, I hear rumors of there being a lot of food in Drainsville. I can't go get it, but if you go get it, it would be really helpful. And so they care more about the food than the civilians, whereas the U.S. Army, it's the opposite. They want to stop this persecution of Unionists, and since we're in the neighborhood, we'll get some food too. So it's almost like the two sides had switched priorities in the fall of 1861.
okay, so and then the follow on with the civilians, you near the end of the talk, you were talking about the post-war and the interactions. First off, did the original citizens, for the most part, come back to Drainsville, or once they left, did they not come back? And if there must have been a mix of citizens coming back, was there bad blood between the different families?
Yeah, that was something that I did a lot of research in, because I figured the same thing, right? You gotta, how do you just get over that? Some of the people stayed away, some people returned, right? Minor Crippen, Nelson Voorhees both returned to their homes in Drainsville. Others went away and never came back. As far as I can tell, those who came back let bygones be bygones, right? When the war ended, they just said, that was then, this is now, let's move on with our lives. I think the Day brothers helped with that by being good doctors, right? If somebody needed help, the Day brothers were there. In fact, when John T. Day died, a church in Herndon put up a memorial stained glass window for him. So I think they kind of helped turn the page by just being good doctors. But others, I think, decided, hey, that really sucked. Let's move on with our lives. And so by the 1870s, it seems like things had calmed down pretty significantly.
Okay, thank you.
I was interested in the same exact thing. How do you go from hating each other to being okay? But it seems like that's what they did. So
I have a question, Ryan. Mark Thompson here. I too enjoyed this presentation. It was a lot of information that I didn't know about. And one of the things that sort of caught my interest was this punitive expedition that goes into Drainsville by the Federals to obviously provide some protection for civilians. And I wondered, in your research, have you encountered other communities like Drainsville where Federal expeditions were out there doing similar work around this same time?
Yeah, that's a good question. Fairfax County as a whole in the fall of 1861 was kind of like that, up to right about Manassas. Of course, with Manassas being Confederate headquarters, you can't go much further than that, but they're keeping an eye on Alexandria. They're keeping an eye on Drainsville, Lewinsville, Langley, as well as other expeditions being done. I don't want to go too far afield, but Corinth, Mississippi, when it falls to federal forces are prowling the area, making sure that Unionist citizens are being okay, and the Union Army sets up contraband camp for formerly enslaved to go into Corinth to protect them. And so Drainsville is not unique, but it is one of the more pronounced examples that I can think of. Sure.
Thank you.
Yeah. Anyone else have any questions?
I've got one more, Ryan, about the aftermath. I'm just trying to run through my head the sequence of events here as far as the battles during the early part of the war,
Yeah.
especially in Northern Virginia. Is this the first time the Union actually won one? I mean, sent some Confederates off the field and they could claim a victory? And if that was the case, did anybody make any hay out of that, like in the newspapers or anything?
Yes and yes. The U.S. Army had won some battles in what we today call West Virginia, Rich Hill, Carnifex Ferry, Philippi, but those are Western Virginia. They're the sideshow. I don't want to be dismissive of them, but they're the sideshow. With Drainsville being so close to Washington, we're talking 13 miles from Washington. People make a big deal out of Washington. Horace Greeley in New York City is talking about how generations will come to know Drainsville. Well, of course, that's not the case, but he's talking about it that way. The London Illustrated News, right? London in Great Britain is printing etches of the Battle of Drainsville. So it's getting foreign recognition as well, because it's this battle at the very end of a very bad, awful, no good year. Because you think about Northern Virginia, 1861, you've got Manassas in July, that's a Union defeat. You've got Ball's Bluff in October, that's a Union defeat. And a whole lot of other smaller skirmishes in between that are, for the most part, Union defeats. And so, yes, they look at Drainsville as the saving grace in this very bad, awful, no good year. Pennsylvania, especially, because all of the U.S. forces at Drainsville are Pennsylvania, the entire state throws a big party, essentially. Philadelphia newspapers, Pittsburgh newspapers, and everything in between are celebrating this victory. It gets so intense that Philadelphia newspapers and Pittsburgh newspapers start arguing with each other on which city deserves more credit for the victory. The Pennsylvania Reserves are just happy to have the occasion. The regiments that fought at Drainsville were able to turn their flags in and got inscribed in gold lettering on their flags, Drainsville. And the whole division came out and watched those flags being presented with the lettering on the side. McClellan is happy because he can finally say to Lincoln, hey, I did something. I'm a McClellan apologist. I like McClellan. And so I find his occasion in the fall of 1861. He's being a good commander, but nonetheless, Lincoln wants him to do more. And so he goes and says, I did something, we won. So yes, Drainsville is being held up as this great to do. When of course we know 160 years later, it's very soon going to be eclipsed by other battles.
Okay.
Ryan, I
Anything
have a
else?
question. I may have just missed it. I'm Jay Oakley.
Hi.
Did either the Union or the Confederate forces realize that they were going into a battle before it happened?
Kind of, sort of. Ord had been told there are Confederates in the area, keep your eye open. Stuart had as well. It seems from my reading and research that Stuart didn't really take the warnings seriously. That's the word I'm looking for. Stuart is bombastic. Stuart is gallant. He rides around a lot. And so I think he gets those reports and he says, we'll deal with it when we deal with it. Stuart had won a small battle called the Battle of Louisville in September of 1861. He won that battle. And so in my reading of events, he says, we won at Louisville, we'll win here too. As he marches towards Drainsville, he leaves around 5:30 in the morning on December 20th. And there are reports that a rocket is fired from outside Union picket posts. And it seems like that rocket was a warning to federal forces in the area that there was a Confederate column moving. But again, Stuart doesn't really take serious measures to protect his column. His infantry was all spread out. His artillery was all spread out when the battle began. So we had to hurry all those forces up when the action begins, which is going to snowball because the Federals were there already. They were already waiting, and they were able to just knock down the Confederates as they came up. Jeb Stuart even says men were knocked down by like 10 pins, like bowling. So the federal forces, I think, took more serious consultation with those warnings and thus were able to win the battle pretty easily.
Thank you.
Sure.
All right, Ryan,
This is Jerry Wilson.
go ahead, sir.
Hi there.
I thank you for allowing me to participate in this this presentation. I'm not a member of this roundtable, so I really appreciate that. I have an interest in this battle since my great grandfather fought with the 10th Alabama, and this was
Okay.
their first real engagement. And I had classified it as a meeting engagement, but I'm going to go back and rethink that a little bit based on your discussion, particularly from the northern perspective, as was asked earlier. So I really appreciate your presentation. It was well done.
Well, thank you. Yeah, the 10th Alabama has a bad day on December 20th. They suffer in the neighborhood of 70 casualties, which for a first battle going in is a rough day. Their colonel is wounded, their lieutenant colonel is killed. The battle ends being commanded by a captain. So the 10th Alabama has a bad day on December 20th.
Yeah, both Forneys were wounded in that battle. Yeah, it was a bad day.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, Ryan, can you just give us a little preview of the book you're writing? I mean, is the book going to basically follow this line of thought about the entire continuum, civilian and not just the battle itself, obviously, but what contributed to it before and after?
So I set out 5 years ago, just a quick word about this, because I worked at Chancellorsville, in the aftermath of Stonewall Jackson's wounding, the question becomes who takes over Confederate infantry? And the answer is eventually Jeb Stuart. And so I asked myself, well, does Jeb Stuart ever command infantry before Chancellorsville? And the answer is Drainsville. So I said, A, what the heck is Drainsville? And B, what the heck happened? And so I set out to do research and writing a tactical analysis of Drainsville. However, I found all of this bits and pieces of civilian stuff and talking to a park historian named Noel Harrison. Noel is a treasure trove of information, as I'm sure many of you know, and he, in his master degree program days, wrote an article about civilian experience in Fairfax County. He sent me that article, and that changed everything. And so my book, which is done and turned into the publisher, I don't know when it's going to be published, but it's turned in. I did my part. Is both an analysis of the battle. 3 chapters are devoted to the battle itself, where X's and O's, where do the units go? And the rest of the book is the civilian experience, right? The lead up to the battle, the civilians, the aftermath of the battle. The last chapter before the conclusion is the commission, the civilian commission, the Pierpont Dix Commission. And so it's a little bit of both. If you want the battle, it's in there. If you want the civilian experience, that's in there too. It's going to be published by Savas Beatie. Again, Ted Savas has it. We'll see what happens next.
Well, good luck on it. I know that, like I said, that first book you wrote on Monocacy was a real helpful treasure trove of information on the battle itself.
Well,
And
thanks.
I'm sure this one is going to be just as good and hopefully as popular as the first one was.
Yeah, well, I appreciate it, John.
So no other questions. I'd like to thank Ryan and thank Ryan for his service as a park employee. Now you're back with us here in Fredericksburg for a while, I hope. And hopefully we'll be opening up in a little bit, so we'll be able to do some of the things and some of the tours that we used to be able to do before this COVID set in. So as I said, for everybody listening, next month we're going to try the live presentation at Brock's. There's going to be some things that we're going to have to change. It's definitely going to be, I ought to mention this, reservation only, because of we're still prohibited from certain numbers. So it's going to be reservation only, and all the members will be getting a email with specific instructions. But basically, you need to make a reservation in order to attend. But we have a lot of things planned for the next few months, including a big raffle, and we also have some excellent speakers coming up. Next month will be David Welker speaking on the Battle of Chantilly or Ox Hill, which is kind of the last part of a trilogy. Ryan, you're in the center here with Drainsville. We had Balls Bluff last month, Drainsville this month, and next month will be Ox Hill. So that'll be kind of our Northern Virginia section of our presentations. So once again, thank you all for coming. I'm glad you could make it and spend some of your evening with us. And hopefully we'll see you all, or a lot of you, in person next month.